to the increasing political, economic, and cultural interdependence of our planet. And so globalization is playing a role here in terms of the development and promotion of these particularist ideas, in this case Islamic fundamentalist ideas. I think all of this suggests, all of these political, cultural, and sociological insights that I have just mentioned suggest the need for a longer-term perspective on the rise of religious fundamentalism and how it relates to the problem of democracy and liberalism in the Muslim world today. It should be pointed out, when thinking about this process of modernization over the long period, that modernization is in and of itself a traumatic process. It should not be forgotten that here in the West, it took several hundred years to develop the modern secular and democratic institutions that currently exist, and much of this was done through trial and error. The wars of religion, political persecution, genocide, the Industrial Revolution, the exploitation of workers, the rise of nationalism, World War I, World War II, resulted in profound changes in all spheres of life here in the West, political, economic, intellectual, and critically religious. Today, I'm arguing that we are witnessing a similar process of transformation and upheaval in developing countries with its concomitant, with its accompanying destabilizing effects. It's important to appreciate also that the modernization process in the Islamic world has been very different in many ways than it has been in the West. Unlike in Europe, where the process of modernization was largely an indigenous and internal process, in the case of most Muslim-majority societies, modernization begins as a direct result of the colonial encounter with Europe. Instead of innovation, the modern experience in most Muslim societies was one of imitation, an attempt to play quick catch-up with the West. Muslim countries in the post-colonial period, post-World War II period, have been unhealthily split into two broad camps: a ruling elite who have received a Western-style education and often internalized secular values, and a large majority that has not. Many regimes in the Middle East continue to be ruled by an aging gerontocracy of men, while the majorities of their populations are under the age of 30. Of course, this was before the Arab Spring, and many of those regimes, thankfully, are falling. Most political change since the era of formal independence in the Middle East and the larger Islamic world, most political change has been a form of political change that has been forced top-down by the state and by the ruling elites who control the state onto society in an accelerated manner. Political change has not emerged, broadly speaking, in the Muslim world as a result of a bottom-up, indigenous internal process, engaging and incorporating civil society and civil society groups in the process of policy formation. So just to say one example that I think really highlights this point. In 1935, the king of Iran, who was this modern, secular, sort of nationalist leader, a man by the name of Reza Pahlavi, the father of the king that was overthrown in 1979. In 1935, Reza Pahlavi wakes up one day and he decides he wants to do something for Iranian women. And so he actually, and this is a true story, he orders his troops to go onto the streets of Tehran and to remove the veil from the heads of Iranian women at bayonet point. Now, if you read the political memoirs of women who were alive that day, this was deeply shocking to a conservative society. Many women did not go out in the street during the daytime out of fear of what they interpret to be forced nakedness. But this is an example of the type of modernization policy that was very draconian and that had negative backlashes and consequences as these societies moved throughout their political history in the 20th century. These policies of draconian westernization or modernization were matched in neighboring Turkey by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, whose harsh secularization and westernization policies had a particular parallel with those of Reza Shah in neighboring Iran. But 2 generations later, in the same authoritarian way that the Pahlavi monarchy in 1935 forcibly removed the veil from the heads of Iranian women, Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamic revolutionaries imposed a new mandatory dress code on the heads of Iranian women with equal determination and rigor. And in other words, the rise of political Islam is partly a reaction to and a rejection of this type of draconian forced modernization on a traditional society without any attempt to engage in a democratic bargaining, negotiation, incorporation, discussion, debate. It was top-down, it was draconian, it was ruthless, and it produced a backlash. It is against this backdrop that I think we need to situate and explore the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism as a historic phenomenon. This is not the first time that societies undergoing intense periods of social change have encountered socially conservative religious protest movements seeking stability and order. Western observers of the Muslim world today need to overcome your historical amnesia about your own history and recognize distinct parallels between what is happening today in the Muslim world and the early phases of modernization in the West. In the post-September 11th euphoria about the superiority of Western values, it is often forgotten that Western history did not begin with human rights, democracy, and free markets, but rather their origins lie elsewhere. Michael Walzer, who is a prominent, arguably one of the leading liberal philosophers in the world today, who teaches at Princeton, wrote his doctoral dissertation at Harvard University on the Puritan Revolution in Europe in the 17th century, a period of civil war and intense turmoil. He provided a comprehensive framework for trying to understand what he called the revolution of the saints, a study in the origin of radical politics. And it's in pursuit of this thesis and its relevance to contemporary Muslim politics today that I want to turn to by way of completing this lecture. Now, the early modern period in England, we're talking about the 16th, 17th century, was a time of intense social transformation, marked by population growth, rural to urban migration, and a receding feudalism. And in covering this time period, Michael Walzer describes the following social problems that provided a fertile soil for the emergence of Puritanism in England in the 16th century. He talks about, in his book, the problem of rural depopulation, vagabondage, and the extensive poverty due to rapid population growth, and the dislocation of men who left the old rural societies, and it sent thousands of beggars wandering the roads of England. I'm quoting from Michael Walzer. For over a century, Walzer writes that these beggars quite literally formed a distinct social group, completely alienated from the world on whose fringes they dwelt. Other men, driven from the land, poured into the cities of England, where they were newly subject to the calamities of depression and urban unemployment. Describing this time period a bit further, Michael Walzer talks about the problem of rapid urbanization. With its intensification of the dangers of plague and fire, brought new men into London who could not be absorbed into the existing civic institutions. In the midst of this turmoil, Walzer writes, Puritanism flourished in the cities and especially in the suburbs of many English towns. And if you look at the records in local churches, recent immigrants often turn up as members of a sectarian religious group. Deprived of a village solidarity, disoriented in the great crowds of England, many men, Walzer notes, must have found solace and comfort in Puritan faith and Puritan discipline. On a related note, Walzer discusses the problem of the religious vacuum left by the slow decay and then the abrupt collapse of the old Catholic Church. At a fairly early point, both in London and in the countryside, this religious vacuum began to be filled by Puritanism, as once again, for many men, Puritanism provided an alternative set of social and spiritual activities. The political order at the time was ripe with corruption and nepotism and anarchy. Driven by a militant religious fervor, the Puritans and their Calvinist ideology, if you don't know who the Puritans are, they can be understood as 16th century Christian fundamentalists. The Puritans and their Calvinist ideology sought to bring order and stability to their community by overthrowing the corrupt establishment and beheading the king. The reference here is to the English Civil War, if you know your English history, the execution of King Charles I. These religious saints as Michael Walzer calls them, were motivated by two things: a fierce antagonism to the traditional world and the prevailing patterns of human relationships, and a keen and perhaps not unrealistic anxiety about human wickedness and the dangers of social disorder. These religious saints attempted to fasten upon the neck of all mankind the yoke of a new political discipline. I'm quoting Michael Walzer here. In trying to assess the behavior of this militant religious group that emerges in England in the 16th and 17th century, in the context of a changing Europe, Walzer describes the Puritans as, quote, an agent of modernization, an ideology of the transition period. Let me repeat that because it's central to my presentation. Walzer describes the Puritans as, quote, an agent of modernization, an ideology of the transition period. Near the end of his book, Walzer attempts to link his case study of English Puritanism to other cultural contexts and societies undergoing intense, rapid social political change. He writes that the Puritan concern for discipline and order is not unique to history. Over and over and over again, since the days of the religious saints, bands of political radicals have sought anxiously and energetically and systematically to transform themselves and the world in which they lived. The key development, according to Walzer, the key development that gives rise to militant religious piety is the breakdown of the old order. Let me repeat that because it's central to my talk. The key development that gives rise to these socially conservative protest groups that are religious in nature is the breakdown of the old order. The choice of religious sainthood in such circumstances, writes Michael Walzer, seems reasonable and appropriate. And in light of the above discussion, given similar historical circumstances, Frenchmen and Russians would make very similar choices. Englishmen became Puritans and then godly magistrates, elders, and fathers in much the same way and for many of the same reasons as 18th century Frenchmen became Jacobins and active citizens, and 20th century Russians became Bolsheviks. Echoing sentiments discussed above about the rise of political Islam, Michael Walzer writes, in different cultural contexts, at different moments in time, religious sainthood will take on different forms, and religious saints will act out different revolutions. But the radical's way of seeing and responding to the world will almost certainly be widely shared whenever groups of men are suddenly set loose from old certainties. Puritanism, therefore, according to Michael Walzer, provided what may best be called an ideology of transition. It was central to the process of European modernization, not because it served the purpose of some universal progress, but because it met a set of human needs during a time of social and political upheaval. During more tranquil times, during more peaceful times, when a semblance of order and peace is restored to the land, the radical ideology of the religious saint no longer has popular appeal, and they gradually disappear from society. In the context of 17th century England, Walzer notes that after the restoration of the British monarchy, the energy of the religious saint was drawn inward, its political aspirations forgotten, and the radical religious saint gave way to the nonconformist, or Lockean liberalism provided an alternative political outlook. This suggests only that these problems were limited to the period of breakdown and psychic and political reconstruction, when men stopped being afraid and Puritanism suddenly became irrelevant. It is a main argument, ladies and gentlemen, of my presentation tonight, that the political modernization of the Islamic world has produced similar forms of radical politics akin to English Puritanism, French Jacobinism, and Russian Bolshevism. And there's a lot of evidence that one can point to. Take the example of the Islamic Republic of Iran today, where internally there is a battle between reformers and hardline conservatives. hardline conservatives still sticking to the radical politics of the revolution, where reformers have morphed into effectively democratic champions for human rights and democracy. But this process of political transformation is playing out in Iran as it is playing out in the Arab Spring. Radical Salafists, mainstream Islamists, secular and liberal forces, all battling against each other. Now, to the extent that Waltzer's model here is valid for understanding the process of modernization in the Muslim world, this would suggest that the actual content of the ideology of these groups is less important than the enveloping socio-economic context and historic moment of development that sometimes demands a transitional, or actually it's more accurate to say, the historic moment that sometimes produces, sociologically, a transitional force of religious saints during a time of political turmoil and disorder. And I think one of the benefits of recalling this particular thesis by Michael Waltzer is that it provides an alternative framework to the popular thesis that you still hear today in the West that emphasizes, quote, the sacred rage of Islam or the inherent clash of civilizations due to some alleged inherent Islamic hatred for the West. This paradigm by Michael Waltzer is also, I think, beneficial because it forces Western observers of the Islamic world to recall your own history of political development, where violent periods marked the transition from tradition to modernity. So let me just conclude here by highlighting a few points that I hope you will think about and reflect upon as you are studying this particular topic and as you are exposed to the different lecturers in this lecture series. Number one, resist the easy temptation to generalize and to view the entire Islamic world and the over 1 billion Muslims who inhabit this planet. Reject the temptation to view the entire Islamic world as a monolith. The tendency to look for the roots of political turmoil in the Islamic world today, in going back to early medieval Muslim history due to some alleged unchanging cultural essence. As if you want to understand politics today, you have to go back to some interpretation of something that happened 1,000 years ago, or if you looked at the Quran to try and understand contemporary politics, that is as problematic and as misleading as trying to interpret the roots of Latino or African American gang activity in American cities today by going back to ancient African or warrior religions. In other words, while history does affect the way people act in the present, history does not absolutely or unequivocally determine what will happen in the future. And secondly, it's important to have a sense of history here, particularly in terms of the history of democracy and human rights. It's important to appreciate that democracy and human rights, as we understand those concepts today, that the realization of democracy and human rights is and came about as a result of a historical process that is evolutionary and that is gradual. Democracy, in other words, requires patience. Let us not forget that in the country, for example, where I currently live, the United States of America, one of the oldest democracies in the world, that in the United States, in this country, they maintained the legal institution of slavery for the first 90 years of the American Republic, while simultaneously laying claim to being a democracy. And then it took another 100 years after Abraham